In a mansion ruled by silence for 4 long years, a young autistic boy suddenly speaks his first word, not to his father, not to a doctor, but to the new black housekeeper mommy. That single word sets off a storm of rage, legal threats, and a father's desperate fight for control. But what if love chooses its own path, no matter the bloodline? If this real-life story moved something in you, we'd love to know. Where are you watching from? And is it morning, evening, or somewhere in between? The Ashford estate, perched like a solemn guardian among weathered oaks along the Connecticut coastline, wore the weight of time like an old overcoat. Its grand facade stood unshaken by salt wind and years, but inside its corridors carried the hush of absence. The marble floors gleamed cold and impersonal beneath the filtered dusk light, and the silence pressed down on every room with the quiet dominance of a memory long unspoken. For 4 long years, young Anthony Ashford had not spoken a single word, not to his teachers, not to his doctors, and never to his father. The boy moved like a whisper through the halls. His presence felt more than heard, his winter gray eyes reflecting something older than his years. Jonathan Ashford, his father, had exhausted every resource known to science and medicine. Specialists had flown in from out of state. Therapists had rotated through the house like clockwork. Each one had left with a reported theory and the same outcome: silence. Jonathan's world was numbers and precision, and his son's silence was the one equation he could never solve. It haunted him, this stillness, this mystery. And then came Ellie Robertson. She arrived without ceremony, just a quiet knock at the door and a single suitcase in hand. As the new household manager, she moved with the kind of grace that didn't need attention. Her eyes noticed everything, but her words were measured. She didn't force her presence, she simply took up the space that had long been abandoned by warmth. The staff respected her almost immediately, though they didn't understand why. She was kind, yes, but it was something deeper, a steadiness, a quiet resilience that lingered even after she left the room. On her third day, Ellie found herself in the playroom, seated on the edge of a thick, colorful rug. The late afternoon sun streamed through the tall windows, laying golden strips across the toys scattered like forgotten ideas. She held a toy train between her fingers, idly turning its little wheels. Anthony sat nearby, legs crossed, eyes fixed on nothing in particular. Then it happened. The sound came so softly it could have been mistaken for the creak of the floorboards or the wind brushing against the panes. But Ellie heard it, a whisper, not breath, not sigh, but word. Mommy. She froze. Her fingers stopped turning the train's wheels. Her lungs locked, her mind stilled. For a moment she didn't dare move. Slowly she turned toward the boy. Anthony's lips were slightly parted, a shimmer clinging to the corners of his wide gray eyes. Ellie leaned forward. "Did you say?" she asked, barely above a whisper. Anthony didn't flinch. He didn't look away. His gaze locked on hers, steady and aching. Then he said it again, clearer this time. "Mommy." His small hand reached forward, instinctively searching for her arm. His fingers brushed her sleeve. Ellie's heart stuttered. Something in her chest broke open. Before she could respond, a voice sharper than a whip crack sliced through the quiet. "What on earth are you doing? Get away from him!" Jonathan Ashford stormed into the playroom, his footsteps thudding hard against the floor. His charcoal suit seemed too tight, as if he'd been caught mid-transformation from man to anger. His face, usually composed and unreadable, was now flushed with disbelief and fury. He pointed at Ellie with a trembling hand. "I said, step away from my son." Ellie rose slowly. Her breath was uneven, her heartbeat loud in her ears. "Mr. Ashford," she said calmly. "He just spoke. He called. I heard what he said," Jonathan barked. His voice cracked at the edges. "And I don't know what game you're playing, but you will not manipulate my son's condition to earn favor in this house." Anthony flinched. His tiny frame began to tremble, his lower lip quivering like a leaf in wind. Then he let out a sound no one in that house had heard in years, a raw, primal sob. "Mommy!" he cried, this time with all the desperation he could summon, stumbling toward Ellie with arms outstretched. Jonathan stepped in to stop him, arms reaching, but the boy fought him, fought hard. He kicked and twisted, crying louder, now eyes wild with fear and confusion. He wanted Ellie, no one else. Jonathan stared, stunned and helpless. "You've been here 3 days, Ellie. 3 days," he said bitterly. "And now he's calling you mother. That's not a breakthrough. That's manipulation." "I never asked him to call me anything." Ellie answered, voice firm but gentle. Not once. Jonathan's anger faltered just a little. Then how do you explain this? He never spoke to me. Not a sound. I spent years, a fortune. He chose, Ellie interrupted softly. He chose to speak, and he chose me. Just now. Anthony had collapsed onto the rug, fists pounding into the thick fibers, his body shaking with sobs that rattled the air. The sound filled the room like the chime of grief echoing in an empty chapel. I want her to stay, he sobbed between hiccups. Jonathan's breath caught. He turned toward the window, gripping the sill tightly. His reflection stared back at him, a man who had tried everything and failed to reach his own child, while a stranger had managed to do it with nothing but kindness. For a long time he said nothing. I want her to stay, Anthony said again, softer now, but with the weight of finality. Jonathan closed his eyes. The numbers, the research, the methods all had fallen short, and in that moment, standing in his finely tailored suit in his own house with his own son broken and weeping on the floor, he realized logic couldn't mend what love hadn't touched. When he finally turned back, his voice was quieter, strained but resolute. You stay. Ellie looked up, startled, but Jonathan wasn't looking at her. His eyes were on Anthony, who was now curled into a ball, clutching her sleeve like a lifeline. Jonathan's voice dropped. But know this, if I ever feel this is a performance, if I see anything that looks like exploitation, you're gone. My son's heart is not yours to break. Ellie nodded once. Understood. She didn't thank him, didn't offer empty words. None were needed. Outside, the sky burned a deep orange as the sun sank into the horizon. Inside, a fortress built from silence had finally cracked, not from pressure or force, but from the smallest word said in the softest voice, Mommy. And everything changed. The next morning in the Ashford household, the kitchen felt different, not louder, not warmer, but changed. The silence had shifted. It was no longer heavy and absolute. Instead, it hung like fragile glass stretched to its limit, a stillness that wasn't peaceful but uncertain, as if one small sound might shatter it. Ellie Robertson stood at the stove slowly stirring a pot of oatmeal. The rhythm of the spoon scraping against the pan was steady, meditative. The early sun filtered through the large bay windows, casting pale rectangles of light on the tiled floor. Outside, frost still clung to the lawn, and the bare branches of the oak trees caught the morning light like delicate bones. Inside, warmth clung low and quiet the way it does after a storm of emotion. She hadn't slept well. The memory of the night before, of Anthony's voice cracking through years of silence, of Jonathan's eruption, of the ache in the boy's cry for her, replayed in her mind like a reel with a torn frame. Ellie could still see Jonathan's face in that moment, not just furious, but devastated. His mask of control had slipped just long enough to expose something raw underneath. And beneath all that rage, Ellie had seen it clearly: grief. Heavy, bottomless grief, the kind that couldn't be reasoned with or solved. She added a spoonful of honey to the pot. Sweet things she'd noticed seemed to bring a little light to Anthony's face. She had seen him hover near the cookie jar more than once, fingers twitching with silent longing, but never daring to take one. That morning she'd make something soft and sweet, something safe. Then footsteps. Soft ones, hesitant. She turned her head. Anthony stood in the doorway, barefoot, his pajamas' rumpled hair tousled from restless sleep. He clutched the sleeves of his shirt in both hands. There was no smile on his face, no burst of energy. But then came a sound, a word. Hi. Ellie's heart paused. She kept her expression calm, voice gentle. Good morning, sweetheart, she said, careful not to crowd the moment. Did you sleep well? Anthony gave a tiny nod. Then, after a second's pause, he stepped fully into the room. He didn't speak again, but he climbed onto one of the stools at the counter with quiet purpose. Ellie placed a bowl of oatmeal in front of him and offered a small smile. It's warm. I added a little honey, she said. If you want more or less or nothing at all, you just tell me. Anthony studied the bowl. Then he looked at her eyes, watchful. Slowly, almost ceremonially, he picked up the spoon and tested its weight. His movements were delicate, as if music might start with the wrong touch. Ellie turned back to the sink, giving him space. She knew better than to hover. Some children needed permission to feel safe. Others needed silence. From the hallway came the unmistakable rhythm of dress shoes on hardwood. The sound was clipped, deliberate. Jonathan Ashford stepped into the kitchen, looking every bit the executive. He was pressed, suit polished, watched the lines of his jaw set with unspoken thought. He paused at the threshold. His eyes moved from his son quietly eating at the counter to the woman beside him. For a moment, Jonathan said nothing. Anthony's spoon froze mid-motion. "Good morning." Ellie offered her tone neutral but steady. Jonathan nodded stiffly. "Morning." He turned toward his son. "Hey, buddy." Anthony looked at him. Said nothing. Jonathan lingered for another moment, then added, "Looks like you're having breakfast with Ellie today." Still no answer, just the soft clink of the spoon returning to the bowl. Jonathan shifted his weight, glancing toward the windows. "I should be heading to the office," he muttered mostly to himself, but he didn't move. He stood there like a man on the edge of a conversation he didn't know how to start. Ellie saw it the way his hands stayed buried in his pockets, the slight tension in his shoulders. She took a breath. Then gently, "He called me mommy again this morning." Jonathan inhaled sharply. He did. Ellie nodded. It wasn't loud, but it was clear, and he wasn't afraid. Jonathan rubbed the back of his neck, his eyes distant. "He never even called his real mother," he murmured. "That—" Ellie didn't flinch. "Where is she?" Jonathan exhaled, eyes drifting to the window as if searching for an answer outside. "Gone. 2 weeks after he was diagnosed. She packed a bag and left. Said Anthony was broken. Said I could keep him." His voice faltered. "We haven't heard from her since." The words landed heavy in the room. Ellie felt them settle in her chest. She had heard stories like that before. Too many. And every time they scraped something inside her. Anthony's spoon moved slower now. The energy had drained from his face. "Maybe," Ellie said softly, "what he sees in me isn't a replacement. Maybe it's just something safe." Jonathan turned to look at her. Really look. His face was tired, lined with years of holding too much too tightly. "And what about you?" he asked. "Why are you here? You don't seem like someone who needs to be changing linens and stirring porridge." Ellie smiled faintly. It wasn't defensive. It was weary. "You'd be surprised what kind of people end up doing this work." There was a pause between them. Not hostile, just thick with unspoken things. Then quietly she added, "I lost a child once, a little boy, heart condition. He was everything to me. I still see him when I close my eyes. But I couldn't save him." Jonathan shifted, caught off guard by her honesty. "I guess," Ellie continued, "being here, helping Anthony, it gives me something to hold on to. Something that tells me maybe there's still good I can do, even in the quiet." Anthony looked up at her, then eyes wide and solemn. Slowly he reached out and placed his small hand on top of hers. Ellie froze, then turned her palm upward and wrapped her fingers around his. The kitchen air shifted. Jonathan exhaled slowly. For the first time his guard cracked. "I'm not used to this," he said. "People, feelings. I know how to run numbers. I know how to win. But this scares the hell out of me." Ellie met his gaze. "It scares me too. But he doesn't need perfect. He just needs present." And for a moment, none of them said anything more. They just sat in that kitchen in the quiet hum of morning light and let something new settle between them. Something fragile, maybe, but real. Later that afternoon, the light had softened in the backyard of the Ashford estate. A pale golden sun hovered above the treetops, casting long shadows across the neatly trimmed lawn. The air carried a faint chill, a reminder that summer was slipping quietly into autumn. In the garden, where hedges framed small flower beds, Anthony Ashford sat cross-legged in the dirt, a plastic spade clutched tightly in one hand. His small fingers worked with quiet concentration, scooping out shallow holes in the soil, not for planting, but perhaps for thinking. Ellie Robertson spotted him through the window and stepped outside, letting the screen door close behind her with a soft creak. Her shoes crunched lightly on the gravel path as she crossed the lawn. She crouched beside him, brushing a dried leaf from his tangled hair. "Hey, sweetheart," she said gently. Her voice was warm, steady, careful not to startle. "Daddy signed you up for a new school." Anthony didn't look at her, but his hand paused mid-dig. The grip on his spade tightened slightly. His body went still in that way children sometimes do when they don't yet have the words to express discomfort. Ellie watched him closely, giving the moment time to unfold. "It's supposed to be fun," she continued, her voice light but sincere, "but only if you want to go." Anthony still didn't speak, but his lower lip began to tremble. The spade slipped from his hand and rested crooked in the soil. Ellie didn't push. She knew the signs. This wasn't defiance. It was fear, guilt, confusion. "You don't have to decide right now," she said softly. "But if you ever feel scared or unsure, you can always tell me, in any way you know how." There was a pause. Then, without a word, Anthony reached into the dirt beside him and picked up a small, cracked pebble. He studied it for a second, then turned to Ellie and placed it silently in her open palm. She looked at it, puzzled. The stone was smooth, insignificant to anyone else, but to Anthony, it meant something. Then he whispered, his voice almost swept away by the breeze. "Stay." The word struck her in the chest. It was so soft, so fragile, but so intentional. She swallowed hard as tears prickled at the back of her eyes. She nodded, her voice barely holding. "I'll stay." That evening, the house was hushed again. Anthony had gone to bed early, worn out not from activity, but from the weight of change. Ellie walked the hall in her slippers, passing framed paintings and polished furniture that never quite seemed to reflect the people who lived there. She stopped outside Jonathan Ashford's study, then knocked lightly. Come in," came his voice, tired and distant. Ellie stepped inside. The room was dim lit by a single brass lamp on the desk. Jonathan sat in a leather armchair near the fireplace, a glass of bourbon in his hand, the liquid catching what little light there was. He looked up at her. His shirt sleeves were rolled to his elbows, and there were lines under his eyes he hadn't had just weeks ago. "I spoke with Anthony," Ellie began. Jonathan leaned back, rubbing his forehead with his free hand. "Did he tell you he doesn't want to go?" Ellie shook her head slowly. "No. He told me he wants me to stay." Jonathan closed his eyes for a moment. He sighed through his nose, the weight of the day pulling at his posture. "Ellie, you've done something here that no one else could. But the truth is, I don't know what our arrangement is anymore." She frowned, not with anger, but confusion. "What do you mean?" He looked into the glass in his hand, but didn't drink from it. "I hired you as a caregiver, someone to manage the house, tend to his needs. But he doesn't see you that way. And to be honest, I don't either. And that scares me." Ellie walked over and sat in the chair opposite him. Her voice didn't waver. "I'm not here to replace anyone, Jonathan. I'm just here to love a child who needed it." He turned his head slightly, his jaw clenched. He looked like a man who hadn't let himself admit weakness in a very long time. "I failed him," he said quietly. "No," Ellie replied, firm but kind. "You've been present in the only way you knew how. But maybe it's time to try something different." He met her eyes as if searching for an answer he didn't yet have. "Like what?" "Like listening even when it's hard, like letting go of control and letting love be messy." Jonathan exhaled a slow, hollow breath. His face softened. "You talk like someone who's been through a war." Ellie smiled faintly, the corners of her mouth tinged with sadness. "I have, and I survived, but the hardest part wasn't the loss. It was learning to let someone in again." The silence between them stretched not awkward, but full. A kind of understanding passed like a current. Then, almost reluctantly, Jonathan said, "You make this place feel like home, Ellie. I don't even know how you do it." She held his gaze with quiet steadiness. "I don't do anything alone. Anthony meets me halfway. That's more than most grown men can say." Jonathan chuckled, then a dry, genuine sound. It wasn't joy exactly, but something closer to relief. A shared truth finally spoken aloud. Saturday rolled in beneath a heavy gray sky, the clouds low and unmoving, as if weighed down by their own silence. A gentle distant rain hummed just beyond the windows, more of a murmur than a downpour. Inside the sunroom, light filtered weakly through the moisture-streaked glass, casting a pale glow over the furniture and hardwood floors. Anthony Ashford sat quietly on the cushioned window seat, his knees drawn up and his breath fogging small circles into the glass. With a fingertip, he traced slow, looping shapes into the condensation. He wasn't speaking, but there was a calmness in his silence. Not fearful, not withdrawn, just thoughtful. That difference meant everything to Ellie Robertson. She sat nearby, folding a basket of laundry on the ottoman, her hands moving with practiced ease, but her eyes never far from him. She hummed softly, not to fill the silence, but to hold space within it. The stillness was broken by Jonathan Ashford's voice. "Can I ask you something?" He stepped into the room holding 2 cups of coffee. The aroma of dark roast filled the space. He handed one to Ellie with a simple gesture. No formality, just something shared. She accepted it. "Of course." Jonathan leaned against the doorframe, his voice curious but quiet. "Why did you really take this job? You could be teaching counseling, working in something that demands more. I've seen how you are with people. You're not ordinary staff." Ellie didn't look up right away. She folded one last shirt and placed it carefully on the pile before answering. "I needed to feel useful," she said at last. Her voice was steady, but her eyes clouded with memory. After my son passed, I couldn't go back to the office or a classroom. I couldn't pretend to be okay." Jonathan nodded slowly as if her words had settled somewhere deep inside him. He looked at her again. "Did you ever think about having another child?" She didn't answer right away. Her gaze drifted toward Anthony. "No, I couldn't imagine loving anyone the way I loved him. Until now." Jonathan followed her eyes. Anthony had dozed off against the window pane, his breath leaving a small, steady patch of fog. He looked peaceful, softer than usual, but there was still something delicate about the way he rested, like a wound still healing. Jonathan set down his cup, rubbing his palms together. "I got a call this morning." Ellie turned slightly, her attention sharpening. "From Veronica Hale, my ex-wife's sister." Ellie sat straighter. "You've never mentioned her." "She called out of the blue," Jonathan said, his tone edged with caution. "Apparently she's been keeping tabs through one of the old therapists. She wants to meet Anthony." Ellie frowned. "Why now?" Jonathan gave a shallow shrug. "I asked her the same. She says she's worried, says I'm letting a stranger become too important in his life." Ellie's jaw tightened, meaning me. He nodded. She actually used the phrase emotional manipulation, said it was dangerous to let a caregiver become a mother figure to a vulnerable child. Ellie let out a short, bitter laugh. "I didn't realize love was something to be cautious of." "She's a lawyer," Jonathan said with a dry shrug. "Everything is strategy and leverage to her." "Is she coming here?" "She asked to visit next week. I told her she could come by, but under strict boundaries. No interference. Still, I don't trust her. I thought you should know." Ellie nodded slowly, her hands resting on a half-folded towel. "Thank you for telling me." Later that afternoon, Ellie sat in the playroom with Anthony. The rain tapped gently at the windows, and soft instrumental music played low in the background. They were stacking blocks, red, blue, yellow, Anthony's small hands, careful and precise. He was quieter than usual, glancing at her now and then with furrowed brows. Then, with quiet focus, he placed a red block in her open palm and whispered, "Sad." She blinked. "What makes you say that, honey?" Anthony looked at her intently. "Your eyes." Ellie wrapped her arms around him, pulling him close. The words hit deeper than he could have known. "I'm okay," she said softly. "Just a little worried." He nuzzled into her neck, his arms clinging to her shoulders. "Don't go." Her throat tightened. She kissed the side of his head. "I won't. I promise." That evening, the rain had slowed to a drizzle, the sky still overcast as dusk settled in. Ellie wandered into the den where Jonathan was sitting with an old photo album open on his lap. The leather binding had aged, but the photos were crisp snapshots of moments they once thought were normal. "That's Anthony's first birthday," Jonathan said, pointing at a photo. "We rented a beach house up in Maine. He didn't smile once. We thought he was just moody." Ellie sat beside him. Her tone was gentle. "You didn't know?" "No," he agreed quietly, flipping the page. "But Veronica did. She was always pointing things out, always certain something was wrong. Wanted him enrolled in a specialized care facility the moment he was diagnosed, said we couldn't handle it." Ellie gave a small nod. Maybe she wasn't wrong about the difficulty, but she was wrong about what he needed. Jonathan looked at her. Which was presence, patience, not perfection. Before they could continue, a knock echoed through the quiet house. Mrs. Quinn, the housekeeper, appeared hesitantly in the doorway. "Sir, Miss Hale is here. She said she's early." Jonathan's expression shifted. "Tell her I'll be right there." When they reached the foyer, Veronica Hale was already inside, her posture rigid in a tailored navy coat. Her eyes, sharp, professional, swept across the room and landed on Ellie. "So," she said coolly, "this is the woman Anthony calls Mommy." Ellie stood still, calm, her chin slightly lifted. Jonathan stepped between them. "Veronica, thank you for coming, but I expect respect." Veronica offered a tight, diplomatic smile. "Of course, I'm just surprised." "Why?" Ellie asked, voice calm but unwavering. "Because you're an employee, and yet you've become emotionally central to a very fragile child." "Emotion doesn't follow contracts," Ellie replied simply. Veronica crossed her arms. "You're playing a dangerous game. Children form attachments easily, but when those attachments are broken..." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. Then Anthony appeared at the top of the stairs. He looked between them, all small hands gripping the banister. Ellie saw him first. "Anthony, it's okay." He took 2 slow steps forward, his gaze locking on Veronica. "Stranger," he said, voice quiet but clear. Veronica blinked. She hadn't expected that. Then Anthony ran to Ellie, wrapping his arms around her hand. "Mommy, don't go." Ellie knelt and embraced him. I'm right here. Jonathan looked at Veronica, his voice calm but final. I think that's all we need for today. Veronica didn't protest, but as she turned to leave, her gaze lingered on Ellie, cold assessing. The rain outside had stopped, but the tension within the house was heavier than ever. Ellie knew this was just the beginning of something harder, and she was ready. The next morning, the quiet inside the Ashford home had shifted. What had once been a soft silence, gentle, even comforting, was now dense and weighted the kind of stillness that hinted something had cracked beneath the surface. The gray morning light barely filtered through the high windows of the kitchen, casting long, pale rectangles across the tiled floor. Anthony sat at the breakfast table, his small shoulders hunched, his fork barely touching the scrambled eggs on his plate. He pushed them around with the edge of his fork, then finally set it down untouched. Ellie Robertson, seated nearby folding a dish towel, watched him with careful eyes. She didn't push. Instead, she waited, letting the boy's quiet lead the moment. He turned his head slightly, his voice so faint it nearly vanished in the hum of the refrigerator. Is she coming back? Ellie knelt beside him, brushing a strand of his hair off his forehead. Her fingers moved gently, almost instinctively, like she'd done it 100 times before. Not unless your daddy says she can. She answered, her voice warm but honest. Anthony's lips trembled. She didn't like you. Ellie managed a smile, but it faltered quickly. No, sweetie, I don't think she did. Upstairs, Jonathan Ashford paced the length of his office. The floor creaked under the steady rhythm of his polished shoes. His phone vibrated again, lighting up the dark surface of his desk with yet another message from Veronica Hale. He didn't need to read it. The last dozen had already said enough subtle jabs disguised as concern. Anthony's emotional development appears concerning undercurrent care. I've contacted Dr. Albright for a second opinion. You should consider temporary custody re-evaluation. Each word landed with the sting of accusation. By the time noon arrived, Jonathan knew this wasn't just worry on Veronica's part. It was a campaign, and it was escalating. When he stepped outside into the mild breeze of early spring, he found Ellie and Anthony seated at the patio table. The wood was worn from years of weather, but today it held a growing tower of wooden blocks, each one carefully placed by small, deliberate hands. Anthony laughed as another block wobbled slightly before settling into place, a real delighted sound that cut right through Jonathan's armor. He paused, watching them. The boy, once silent, now laughed. He couldn't remember the last time that had happened without effort. The sight filled him with something complicated, relief tangled with guilt. He cleared his throat. We need to talk. Ellie shaded her eyes and looked up. Anthony, why don't you go inside and find your train book, sweetheart? Anthony nodded, his laughter fading as he disappeared through the sliding glass door. Jonathan sat heavily, rubbing his temples as though it might ease the pressure in his chest. Veronica's not letting it go. Ellie exhaled slowly. I didn't expect her to. She's contacted child services. Ellie's back straightened. On what grounds? He met her eyes, and for once his defenses were down. Guilt flickered in the tension around his jaw. She's accusing you of overstepping. She claims you're manipulating him emotionally. She brought up your son, said you're trying to replace him through Anthony. Ellie stood. The words hit harder than she expected. That's disgusting. I know, he said quickly, and I don't believe it, but the system doesn't always care what's real, just what can be documented. Her voice shook, but she didn't back down. She's weaponizing grief, my grief, and you let her through the door. Jonathan stood too instinctively defensive. I let her in because I thought she might be civil. I didn't think she'd take it this far. Ellie turned away, blinking fast against the sting in her eyes. I've buried one child, Jonathan. I won't lose another. Not like this. There was a long pause, broken only by the sound of the wind brushing past the hedges. Jonathan's voice was lower now, stripped of his usual confidence. What do we do? Ellie took a breath, deep and steady, grounding herself. We make them see the truth, that Anthony is safe, that he's healing. And if I have to walk through fire for that, I will. That evening, just as dusk settled over the Ashford property and the porch lights flickered on in soft amber glow, a knock came at the front door. The sound echoed through the quiet house like a warning bell. Jonathan opened the door to find two figures waiting, one a woman in a navy blazer holding a clipboard, her expression serious but not unkind. The other a man with weary eyes and a tablet balanced in one hand. "Good evening," the woman began, offering a professional nod. "I'm Miss Evans with Child Protective Services. This is my associate, Mr. Miller. We received a formal concern report regarding the well-being of Anthony Ashford. We'd like to speak with him and his primary caregiver." Jonathan's jaw tightened as he glanced back. Ellie stood a few feet behind him, shoulders squared, her face composed. "You'll get your chance," she whispered to him, then stepped forward. The meeting took place in the living room where warm lamplight softened the tension in the air. Ellie sat on the edge of the couch, answering every question with a calm, measured voice. She provided her credentials, explained. Her background outlined her daily routine with Anthony in precise detail. Her tone never wavered. Every word was rooted in truth. She welcomed their inspection. Anthony's room, his artwork, even the charts they'd kept tracking his progress. Anthony, small and solemn on the couch with his favorite plush elephant clutched to his chest, responded gently to the more basic questions. When Miss Evans asked, "And who is Ellie to you?" the boy didn't pause. "She's my mommy now," he said simply, "not by blood, but in my heart." The room grew still. Even Mr. Miller's pen froze mid-note. Miss Evans nodded slowly, making a final note on her clipboard. "Thank you, Anthony." Once they left, Jonathan collapsed into the armchair, rubbing his face with both hands. "You were incredible." Ellie didn't smile. She sat across from him, hands clasped in her lap. "Anthony was the one who told the truth. I just helped him feel safe enough to say it." Later that night, the house had quieted again. Anthony was asleep upstairs, and the wind rattled the bare branches outside. A gentle knock tapped at Ellie's door. She opened it to find Jonathan, his tie loosened, eyes tired but clear. "I want to fight this," he said. "Not just defend. Fight legally and officially. I want Veronica kept away, and I want us to define what this is. You, Anthony, me." Ellie stared at him for a long beat. "Are you asking me to stay?" He nodded, as more than an employee. Her voice was soft but certain. "I don't want to be anything if it's just out of gratitude or fear. Anthony deserves stability, and so do you." "It's not fear," Jonathan said, his voice steady. "Not anymore." Ellie stepped back and motioned him inside. "Then let's talk." Outside, the trees rustled in the night breeze. Inside, two people who had both lost more than they could name sat down to imagine a future neither had planned for, but both were ready to protect. The fight wasn't over, but a line had been drawn, and love, uninvited but undeniable, had taken its ground. The courthouse on Maple Street was modest, 2 stories of aging brick with worn stone steps and a flag swaying gently in the morning wind. But to Jonathan and Ellie, it felt like stepping into the heart of a storm. Inside, the corridors hummed with quiet urgency, lawyers whispering the soft squeak of shoes against tile, the flutter of file folders exchanged between paralegals. Anthony sat on a wooden bench just outside the family courtroom, his small hands gripping Ellie's fingers tightly. He glanced up at her, his eyes clearer than she had ever seen. "I'm not scared," he said. Ellie smiled and smoothed a curl from his forehead. "Neither am I." At exactly 8:50, Veronica Hale entered dressed in a charcoal suit with a pearl brooch pinned neatly at her collar. Her heels clicked confidently across the tile. Behind her came Miss Albright, a woman whose stern presence commanded immediate attention. Neither of them acknowledged Ellie or Anthony, but Veronica's eyes met Jonathan's with an unmistakable challenge. The hearing was not yet a custody trial. It was a formal review prompted by Veronica's motion for protective oversight, citing emotional entanglement between Anthony and a non-parental caregiver. Inside the courtroom, Ellie sat beside Jonathan at the respondent's table. Her hands were folded tightly, her posture straight. Judge Harding, a sharp-eyed woman in her early 60s, presided over the hearing. "This court understands the emotional weight of the matter," she said, glancing over her glasses. "But we are here to evaluate facts, not sentiment. Let's begin." Miss Albright stood. "Your Honor, my client Miss Hale seeks only to ensure that Anthony Ashford is not subjected to inappropriate emotional reliance on an individual who has no legal or biological claim to him. This is not personal. It's a question of judgment." Ellie kept her expression neutral, though her heart was pounding. Jonathan's attorney, Mr. Davies, responded calmly. "Your Honor, we intend to show that Miss Robertson's role in Anthony's life has not only been appropriate, it has been vital to his recovery. Her care has led to marked improvements in his emotional expression and development. The child is not in distress. He's thriving." Veronica's gaze bore into Ellie, cold and unrelenting. There was something behind her eyes, not just suspicion, but perhaps a kind of resentment that had nothing to do with Anthony at all. Judge Harding called the first witness Dr. Fan, the child psychologist, who had assessed Anthony's condition both before and after Ellie's arrival. Prior to Miss Robertson's involvement, Dr. Fan said clearly, Anthony displayed significant withdrawal and speech delays. Within weeks of consistent care, he began initiating communication, expressing affection, and showing preference. These are major milestones. Miss Albright objected. Correlation is not causation. Dr. Fan did not blink. Perhaps, but when you see a child change before your eyes, when he finally speaks, finally laughs, you don't question the value of presence. You embrace it. Then Ellie took the stand. She spoke plainly without embellishment. She described her background, the death of her son, and her decision to work in caregiving. I didn't come here looking to replace anything, she said. I came because presence matters, and Anthony needed someone to be there. Not perfect, just there. Miss Albright leaned in. Do you consider yourself a mother figure to Anthony? Ellie looked at the boy sitting quietly near the back, his legs swinging slightly above the ground. I consider myself whatever he needs me to be. I never asked for a title. He gave me one. Jonathan testified next. His voice didn't tremble. Ellie didn't force herself into our lives. She showed up when things were hard. She stayed. And every day, Anthony chooses her. Miss Albright pushed, Are you emotionally involved with Miss Robertson? A ripple moved through the room. Jonathan answered without pause. Yes, but my support of her presence in my son's life started long before that, and it stands whether she stays in mine or not. Judge Harding looked between them, her gaze thoughtful. This court is not concerned with private relationships unless they affect a child's welfare. The question remains, is Anthony Ashford at risk? Before anyone could speak, Anthony rose from his seat. The bailiff began to move, but the judge held up her hand. Let him approach. Anthony walked slowly to the bench, a folded piece of paper in his hand. He handed it to the judge. She unfolded it carefully. A crayon drawing, 3 figures holding hands, 1 tall man, 1 tall woman, 1 small boy. Above them in shaky, colorful letters, the words, My Safe Place. Judge Harding stared at the paper for a long moment, then addressed the room. This drawing speaks more clearly than any argument. What I see is a child anchored by consistency and care. I see no signs of manipulation, no cause for oversight. Miss Robertson will remain in her role with the full support of Mr. Ashford. Veronica's jaw tightened. Her attorney whispered something, but she did not respond. Outside the courtroom, Ellie crouched beside Anthony. You were so brave, she whispered. He smiled, tired but proud. You're my safe place. Jonathan stood beside them, his voice rough with emotion. You gave him more than a voice, Ellie. You gave him trust. She looked at him, eyes steady. Then we protect it, together. And in that quiet moment, the courthouse faded. What remained was a choice one made in grief, rebuilt through patience, and now sealed by something stronger than law. A family, not by blood, but by love. Autumn had settled gently over the Ashford estate, wrapping the house and its grounds in a golden stillness. The trees, once lush and green, now stood cloaked in amber and copper, their leaves cascading like slow-moving confetti across the cobbled paths and manicured hedges. The crisp air slipped in through cracked windows, filling rooms with the faint scent of pine and wood smoke. Inside, the rhythm of life had become softer, steadier. Anthony had begun to flourish in ways no one had dared hope for months earlier. His words came more often, less hesitant, spoken not only to Ellie Robertson, but to Jonathan Ashford as well. There were even moments of laughter, true free laughter, echoing through the sunroom or across the lawn. His sentences were still sparse, but the intent behind them grew stronger every day. One cool Thursday morning, Ellie was in the study, organizing children's books into labeled bins, the scent of aged paper and lemon oil filling the space. That's when she heard it, the soft, hesitant sound of piano keys. Not a song, just a few uncertain notes, as though someone were testing memory rather than playing from skill. She paused, set down a hardcover copy of Asterisk, the Velveteen Rabbit Asterisk, and moved quietly toward the hallway. In the music room she found them. Jonathan sat at the piano shoulders, slightly hunched, 2 fingers pressing gentle notes into the silence. Beside him stood Anthony, wide-eyed and still watching with fascination. I used to play when I was a kid, Jonathan said, without turning his voice low and thoughtful. Haven't touched this thing in over 20 years. Anthony reached out and pressed a key next to his father's. The resulting chord was clumsy, jarring. Jonathan smiled. That's okay. Sometimes things don't sound right until we figure out the rhythm. Ellie lingered in the doorway, unseen, her heart full and aching. This was healing. Not dramatic, not loud, just slow, honest moments layered over time. A father and son finding each other one note at a time. Later that morning, Ellie sorted the mail at the kitchen counter. Bills, a garden supply catalog, and then something different. An envelope pale gray and unusually heavy tucked between the others. Her eyes caught the embossed crest stamped into the corner, the Ashford family emblem. But Jonathan never used personalized stationery. She turned it over. It wasn't sealed with glue, but wax. Intentional. Formal. Jonathan entered just as she was examining it. This yours? She asked, holding it out. Her voice was flat, unreadable. He took it, turned it in his hand. The wax seal cracked as he opened it. No, he said. It's from Veronica. This is her legal stationery. I haven't seen this in years. He unfolded the letter and read quickly. His face changed. The message was short. To whom it may concern. This correspondence serves as notification of a motion filed to initiate a formal investigation into the guardianship environment of Anthony Ashford. The petition references alleged inconsistencies in daily care structure, unauthorized emotional reliance on non-legal parties, and potential for future custody compromise. All documentation will be subpoenaed accordingly. Respectfully, Veronica Hale. Jonathan lowered the paper. She's going to court again. But this time, she's not just trying to discredit you. Ellie's voice was quiet but clear. You mean she's trying to take Anthony away? He nodded grimly. She's questioning my guardianship too. The kitchen fell silent. Outside, the wind pressed softly against the windows, making the hanging branches sway. I'll call Mr. Davies, Jonathan said after a moment. We'll handle this like we did before. Ellie shook her head, her arms folding tightly across her chest. No, we can't handle it like before. She's raising the stakes. That evening, they met with Mr. Davies in Jonathan's private office. The room smelled faintly of leather and tobacco, the soft tick of the grandfather clock filling the pauses in conversation. She's playing a longer game now, Davies said, his tone calm but grave. She knows undermining Ellie on her own isn't enough. She's coming after the structure. If she can prove emotional instability, lack of professional boundaries, or questionable decisions, she could argue for emergency custody. Ellie's voice was firm. She wants the court to question whether either of us is fit. Davies nodded. She's already filed to access Anthony's therapy records. And he paused, hesitating for the first time. What else? Jonathan asked. Davies sighed. She's requested a background check on Ellie, including sealed records from Mississippi. Ellie went still. Her expression hardened. She's going after my past. Jonathan's voice lowered. Do I need to be worried? There was a long silence. Then Ellie stood, walked to the window, and stared out into the darkening yard. When my son passed, she said slowly, there was an inquiry. He had a heart condition. We knew that. But he collapsed at home, and I was alone with him. They said I should have gotten him to the hospital faster. I was investigated for neglect. Her voice wavered just once. I lost everything, my job, my license, my home. Jonathan looked devastated. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. They cleared me eventually, Ellie continued. No charges were filed, but the damage had been done. I've spent the last 5 years rebuilding my life from ashes. I didn't think anyone would dig that far back. Davies nodded solemnly. She's banking on perception, not fact, but we'll fight it. Just be ready. That night, Ellie couldn't sleep. The house was silent except for the faint ticking of clocks and the creak of wood settling. She moved softly down the hall, her bare feet cold against the polished floor. Anthony's door was slightly ajar. She peeked inside. The soft glow of his nightlight lit the room with a golden hue. He lay curled beneath his comforter patterned with stars and planets. One arm rested on the stuffed elephant Jonathan had given him after the court hearing. On the wall above him hung the painting, his painting those familiar red and gold swirls. Ellie stepped into the room and knelt beside his bed. She reached up, brushed the curls from his forehead. His brow furrowed. Ellie, he whispered sleepily. I'm here, she whispered back. He sat up slightly, eyes still heavy with sleep. Bad dream. She wrapped her arms around him. It's okay. I've got you. He nestled into her chest. Don't let her take me. Ellie's heart broke in silence. She held him tighter. I won't, she said. I promise. Spring trembled just beyond the edge of the horizon, coaxing soft shoots of green across the grounds of the Ashford estate. The snow had finally released its grip, leaving behind damp soil patches of budding grass and the scent of something new in the air, promise, perhaps. Inside the house, the atmosphere buzzed with a gentle excitement. It wasn't loud or chaotic, but rather the hum of life returning to rhythm after long months of uncertainty. Anthony Ashford, now moving with more confidence than ever, darted through the hallway with his backpack hanging from one shoulder. His pajamas had been traded for a shirt he'd picked himself blue with a rocket ship blazing upward. He bounced on the balls of his feet near the entryway, his energy barely contained. Today marked his first real party. A few children from his speech group were coming to celebrate his progress, not just his milestones, but the person he was becoming. In the kitchen, Ellie Robertson crouched by a cooler, tucking juice boxes between rows of fruit and cupcakes she had carefully arranged that morning. From the study, Jonathan Ashford appeared, his usual formality, replaced by a casual button-down and jeans. In his hand, he held a plain manila envelope. He passed it to Ellie with a kind of reverent calm. Her eyes scanned the printed words quickly, then more slowly. Congratulations. Admission offered. Scholarship. It was from a private school, a rare one tailored for children with learning differences, one that saw potential where others saw struggle. She glanced toward Anthony, who was now demonstrating how his communication device worked to a curious friend with proud, measured enthusiasm. When he caught Ellie's gaze, he grinned, bright, unfiltered, and entirely his own. She closed the letter and folded into Jonathan's arms, her voice low but firm. He's more than ready. Outside, the lawn welcomed guests with sunshine and a gentle breeze that lifted helium balloons and set them bobbing above the swing set. Small clusters of parents chatted near folding chairs while children explored the yard. Mrs. Quinn, ever steady, carried platters of snacks out from the kitchen, setting them on a long table covered in a checkered cloth. By the fence, Veronica Hale stood beside Anna, deep in conversation that had none of the edge it once carried. Time and honesty had shifted something fundamental between them. Anthony approached his crutches tucked under his arms, knees, muddy from earlier therapy games. He dropped to one knee in front of Ellie and peeled off a name sticker that read, "Anthony, I speak." He pressed it into her palm. "For you," he said, voice clear. Ellie touched it to her chest. "I will, sweet boy." Jonathan raised his hand, calling gently for attention. The chatter eased. "Thank you for being here," he began. "Today isn't only about how far Anthony has come. It's about what helped him get here. The consistency, the care, the courage to believe that love could be louder than fear." Ellie stood beside him, her hand resting lightly on his back. She looked toward Anthony now, orchestrating a cardboard castle-building session on the lawn, his voice rising in gleeful command. Laughter followed him like sunshine, unforced and pure. Veronica approached, holding a small potted flower. "For new roots," she said quietly. Ellie accepted it with a trembling breath. "Thank you." Veronica nodded. "For all of us." Anthony ran up, looked at the plant, and pointed. "That's hope," he said matter-of-factly. Jonathan knelt beside him. "You planted it." Anthony beamed. Ellie scooped him into a hug, and Jonathan joined them. They stood together like that, arms linked, hearts full, as the day softened toward evening. Later, as golden light slipped through the sunroom windows, Ellie and Jonathan watched Anthony chase bubbles across the grass. His legs were steadier, his laughter louder. "He's free," Ellie whispered. Jonathan wrapped his arm around her. "He's ours." She turned to face him. "This isn't an ending. It's our beginning." He smiled. "Then let's write every word together." That night, after the last car pulled away and the lights were dimmed low, Ellie knelt beside Anthony's bed. He reached for her hand. "Tell me the first note of forever," he murmured. She kissed his cheek gently. "You already know." He blinked sleepily. "It's love." "Yes," she whispered. "Love is the first note of forever." She tucked the covers around him, and as his breathing slowed into sleep, Jonathan stood in the doorway, watching quietly. Ellie looked up, their eyes meeting across the still room. No more words were needed. The silence between them was rich with meaning. Outside, stars scattered across the sky like gentle promises. Within the walls of their home, warmth glowed in each room. They had weathered storms, legal battles, and personal reckonings. And now, in the hush of this spring night, what remained wasn't just peace, but something deeper, a shared truth. That family in its truest form is chosen each day, nurtured in the quiet, and held close in the dark. Theirs was a story still unfolding, written not on paper, but in the moments that mattered most. The next morning, they began documenting everything: schedules, meals, therapy sessions, reading, logs, art projects. Jonathan Ashford installed cameras in the main rooms, not for surveillance, but to ensure full transparency. If they were going to be scrutinized, they would do so on their terms. Ellie Robertson called her old friend Anna, a retired social worker who had once testified in her favor. "I knew she'd come for you," Anna said over the phone, her voice rough but certain. "I felt it in my bones the moment you told me about that boy. She's relentless. She's afraid of how much that child loves you, of what that says about her own failures." Anna agreed to testify again if needed. "You're not alone this time," she promised. As the days unfolded, the house took on a strange energy, tense like a stretched string on the verge of snapping. Yet somehow, within that pressure, moments of tenderness remained. Anthony Ashford began reading aloud at bedtime. His words were halting and careful, with pauses for correction, but they came with pride. His favorite book, Harold and the Purple Crayon became part of their evening ritual. Every night he stopped on the page where Harold draws a moon and whispered, "That's you. You follow me in the dark." And every night Ellie kissed his forehead and said nothing. She didn't have to. One afternoon, Ellie was walking back from the mailbox, the sky above slate gray, a breeze picking at the edges of her jacket. As she neared the house, a black SUV slowed near the front gate. She stopped. Her hands instinctively tightened around the letters in her grasp. The tinted window rolled down. Veronica Hale. She wore dark sunglasses and a faint smirk, like someone who already knew the end of the story. "Heard you've been busy," Veronica said casually, "preparing your defenses." Ellie didn't respond. "You should enjoy these last few weeks," Veronica continued almost sweetly. "This ends soon. The law is on my side." "No," Ellie replied calmly. "The law is on the side of the child, and he's already made his choice." The smirk wavered. "You think this is about love? This is about structure, responsibility. You really think affection outweighs legacy blood?" Ellie stepped closer to the iron gate. Her voice remained steady. "I think a child's heart knows who shows up every day. Rain or shine, that's legacy." The SUV pulled away slow and smooth, but Veronica's cold gaze stayed with Ellie long after the vehicle disappeared. Inside, Anthony had been watching from the hallway window. "She's mad," he said simply. Ellie nodded, because love scares her. He pressed his small hand against the glass. "We're stronger." Yes, Ellie thought, we are. But she also knew the real storm hadn't even started. Later that day, the study inside the Ashford home sat in near silence. Late afternoon light fell through the tall windows, casting long golden lines across a desk now cluttered with documents and notes. Legal binders, reports, correspondence. It all looked like a war table. Jonathan sat behind it, his shoulders tight, a furrow between his brows. Ellie stood near the window, arms folded, her gaze focused and unwavering. Mr. Davies paced slowly along the carpet, flipping through pages. "We'll need everything," he said without preamble. Ellie's records, Anthony's school notes, therapist logs, even the camera footage Jonathan installed. Jonathan opened his laptop and began typing. "I'll compile it tonight." Ellie walked over and laid several folders down on the desk. "These are my references, early evaluations from Anthony's pediatrician, progress reports from Dr. Fan." And here she handed over a small blue notebook. "This is Anthony's journal. He writes in it, draws, expresses himself. It's in his own hand. He wants to share it." Mr. Davies paused, intrigued. Not standard, but it shows intention. Jonathan glanced at Ellie, his voice softer now. "He's growing. More than I ever thought possible." Mr. Davies nodded once. "That's exactly what you need to show. That the development is happening here, with both of you." Veronica Hale's legal team had already begun issuing data requests. Subpoenas were in the works. The next stage could mean mediation or another courtroom battle. That evening, Ellie stepped into the playroom, a plate of peanut butter and jelly sandwiches in hand, their Friday evening tradition. Anthony was on the rug, arranging toy dinosaurs in careful rows, humming a melody he'd clearly made up. "Hi, buddy," she said, gently setting the plate on the low table. "Ready for snack?" He paused, looked up at her, and reached out, touching her arm. "Mama!" Her breath caught. She knelt beside him. "That's my name now, huh?" He nodded. "Your name." Her eyes filled, but she blinked quickly, keeping the tears at bay. "And you're Anthony." He smiled proudly. They ate together in quiet harmony, the kind only love could bring. Ellie watched him closely, how he held the sandwich, how the peanut butter clung to the corners of his mouth. She remembered how his first words had arrived, shy, barely formed, but so full of effort. What they had now wasn't fragile, it was earned. Later that night in the kitchen, Ellie found Jonathan pacing again. The kitchen was dim lit only by a low lamp near the sink. He stopped when he saw her. "How are you holding up?" she asked softly. He shook his head, rubbing the back of his neck. "It's like walking a tightrope. One wrong step and everything falls apart." She reached out her fingers, grazing his arm. "Then we walk it together." He closed his eyes. "I don't even know what together means anymore." She exhaled. "It means we choose Anthony. Every single day. Even when we're scared." He opened his eyes. They were glassy with emotion. "Okay." The next morning's routine unfolded with a delicate, almost ceremonial precision. Breakfast was prepared quiet and modest. Anthony Ashford sat at the table stirring his spoon in the cereal bowl more than he ate. Ellie Robertson offered soft encouragements, her voice low but warm. Jonathan Ashford hovered in the kitchen, folding a newspaper but not reading it, the tension in his shoulders giving away the strain beneath his collected exterior. The car ride to school was short, almost wordless, but not cold. There was a shared awareness in the air, as if everyone understood something larger was about to begin. Later that morning, confirmation arrived. Veronica Hale's lawyer had officially filed the subpoena. The mediation hearing was scheduled for the following week. A formal meeting with lawyers, a mediator, and both families present. Jonathan and Ellie knew they needed more than just folders and footage. They needed a voice from the past. That afternoon, Ellie picked up the phone and called Anna, the retired social worker who had stood beside her once before. Anna didn't hesitate. "I knew she'd come for you," Anna said over the phone. Her voice was raspy, grounded in wisdom and experience. "The moment you told me about that boy, I felt it." Veronica's terrified of what his love for you says about her absence. Anna arrived the next day bringing not just paperwork, but presents. She had letters of recommendation, agency evaluations, and documentation from Ellie's prior case, showing not just that she had been cleared, but that her reputation had been rebuilt. When Anthony returned home from school and saw Anna, he ran straight into her arms. The hug was natural tender. Anna whispered something to Ellie that brought tears to her eyes. Ellie nodded in silence. When the day of mediation arrived, the Ashford home transformed. The living room had been rearranged, coffee table, moved aside chairs placed in a circle to accommodate everyone. Sunlight filtered through tall windows, illuminating the tension hanging in the air. Jonathan sat beside Ellie on the couch. Anthony was on the floor with a coloring book, his stuffed elephant never far from reach. Veronica entered with her attorney composed and brisk. Her posture said confidence, her expression restraint. Across from them, Mr. Davies opened his briefcase and began. "This meeting is about Anthony's best interest," he said, clear and measured. "We submit evidence of growth therapist corroboration progress in education, emotional stability. We request that Veronica Hale end her legal claim and acknowledge the parenting team Anthony already recognizes his father and the woman he calls mom." Veronica's attorney responded with a polished rebuttal. "With all respect, a non-relative cannot assume a permanent parental role. Miss Hale's concern is for the child's identity. Emotional dependency must be approached with caution." Veronica folded her hands. "This isn't about fear. It's about boundaries. If Miss Robertson leaves, what happens to Anthony? What stability is left?" Jonathan leaned forward, his voice calm. "Anthony has me, and this home. Ellie isn't leaving. That's not hypothetical. That's decided." Veronica looked at Anthony. He was still coloring, but had heard every word. "Anthony," she asked softly, "do you get scared when Ellie isn't there?" He hugged his stuffed elephant tightly. "Scared? Because she's my mommy." The room went silent. Veronica's face didn't change much, but her eyes betrayed her. Something flickered doubt, maybe grief. Ellie knelt beside Anthony, touching his back. "He knows me. He trusts me. I'm not going anywhere." Jonathan stood. "We want to propose formal co-parenting, shared guardianship between Ellie and me, structured visitation rights for Veronica. Anthony deserves something solid." Mr. Davies handed over a draft agreement, temporary co-guardianship legal framework, documented involvement. The mediator took notes, asked for a short recess. During the next hour, the conversation grew heavier. Arguments were exchanged. Veronica's team held firm on limits. Jonathan and Ellie stood just as firm on permanence. But the shift came when Dr. Fan joined by phone. Her voice was direct professional. She recounted Anthony's milestones not as a result of therapy alone, but because of daily love, constant presence. "What this child has built isn't incidental," she said. "It's foundational." Finally, the mediator turned to Veronica. It's clear Anthony is thriving in this environment. The emotional bond with Miss Robertson has become a core part of his development. The question is whether we honor that bond or try to regulate it out of fear. Veronica sat still for a long moment, her fingers clenched around the edge of the chair. I love my nephew. I've made mistakes. I just want to know he's safe. Ellie cleared her throat gently. He is, and so am I. Anthony looked between the two women. You can visit, he said, voice small. I still tell your stories. Veronica blinked quickly. She gave a single nod. The mediator smiled faintly. Then we have agreement. Temporary guardianship shared between Jonathan Ashford and Ellie Robertson. Visitation rights for Veronica Hale. We'll proceed to draft the formal paperwork. Relief swept through the room like air returning to lungs. Ellie leaned back, letting the weight drop from her shoulders. Jonathan exhaled long and deep. Veronica stood, then surprised everyone by offering her hand to Ellie. Thank you, she said, for loving him. Ellie took her hand gently. He's family. That makes you family, too. Anthony wrapped his arms around both women, his smile wide, his grip solid. Later, outside, under the soft light of a descending sun, Jonathan placed his hand on Ellie's shoulder. You are my family. Ellie turned eyes soft and wrapped her arms around Anthony. He squeezed tight, grounding them both in something real. In that quiet embrace, beneath the gold wash of early evening, no court, no clause, no title could define what had been forged. Love consistent lived witnessed, had done what it always does when given the space to grow. It endured. The weeks that followed passed like the slow settling of dust after a long, rattling storm. Documents were signed, the court's seal of approval affixed, and Ellie Robertson was now in both name and law a legal guardian to Anthony Ashford. What once had been a hope, soft, fragile, always one gust away from vanishing, was now real, recorded, and recognized. But peace, as always, never settled entirely. It fluttered around them in small doses, still easily stirred by the winds of memory or fear. That Friday evening, the sky over the Ashford estate rolled in with a heavy gray hanging low like it meant to press against the rooftop. A sharp wind twisted through the trees outside, snapping at branches and bending the trunks into uneasy shapes. Rain had started in scattered spurts and now clattered heavily against the tall windows. In the kitchen, Jonathan Ashford stood by the island unpacking groceries, while Anthony sat cross-legged on the tiled floor nearby, focused assembling a small model rocket. I think we'll lose power, Ellie murmured as she stepped into the room, glancing up at the dimming sky. We've got backups in the basement, Jonathan replied calmly, but with a slight edge of concern. The generators are ready. Ellie crouched down beside Anthony. What's this one called? Voyager, he said with confidence. It goes far. Farther than anything. She smiled, tucking a loose strand of hair behind his ear. I believe that. Will you show me how it works after dinner? He nodded eagerly. The lights blinked once, a quick flicker, then again, and this time they didn't come back. Jonathan sighed, setting down a carton of milk. I'll go start the generator. I'll light candles upstairs, Ellie said. They moved without panic, with a kind of practiced rhythm that had grown between them. She passed through the hallway, lighting sconces as she went, the flames casting warm halos against the cool walls. She paused outside Anthony's bedroom. The door was ajar. Inside, he had moved to his desk now, drawing by the beam of a flashlight propped up in a mug. A low rumble of thunder rolled through the house. Anthony jumped his crayon, slipping from his fingers. Ellie stepped inside. It's okay. Is it like a monster, he asked. No, she said, with a smile, kneeling beside him. Just the sky telling stories. He climbed into her lap without hesitation. Can we read? She reached for the familiar book Herald and the purple crayon asterisk and opened to the first page. Her voice rose gently above the soft patter of rain. As she read, his breathing steadied, his small frame pressing into hers, the tension melting away. When Jonathan returned, he found them curled together on the beanbag chair. He stood in the doorway without speaking, watching the two people he loved most exist in a kind of quiet he hadn't known he needed. Later, after Anthony had fallen asleep, Ellie stepped into the hallway. Jonathan was waiting. Everything's stable, he said. Generators running. Good, she replied. He's asleep. I think the storm spooked him. Jonathan leaned against the wall, arms crossed. It spooked me too. Ellie tilted her head slightly. Not just the weather, huh? He looked at her, then no hesitation. I've spent years trying to control everything. My company, Anthony's diagnosis, even how I felt. But I couldn't control what happened the night he called you mommy. And I couldn't control what that did to me. Ellie didn't say anything. She knew some truths needed time to echo. I think I was afraid, he continued, that if I loved you, I'd lose the version of myself that survived all this. But now, I see it's the loving that's kept me whole. She stepped closer slowly. We're stronger together, Jonathan, but only if we face the storm, not avoid it. He reached out, brushed her cheek gently. She leaned into his touch. That night, as wind rattled the windows and the house thrummed with the steady hum of the generator, they sat close on the couch. Ellie held Jonathan's hand in one and Anthony's drawing in the other, a crayon depiction of a house, a rocket, and 3 smiling stick figures beneath a bright, steady moon. The following morning, as the storm gave way to a soft drizzle and a washed-out sky, the doorbell rang. Standing on the porch was Veronica Hale. She wore a navy raincoat, her eyes softer than Ellie had ever seen them. "I didn't come to fight," she said simply. Ellie stepped aside without a word. Veronica entered slowly, glancing around the foyer with a kind of quiet reverence. In her hands was a thin folder. "I was going through some old boxes and found this." She opened it, revealing a stack of handwritten letters. "They're from Anthony's mother, my sister-in-law. She sent them to me during her last year." The letters were worn with time, but still legible, filled with warmth, sorrow, and love. In one, her words were direct asterisk. "If anything happens to me, tell Jonathan to find someone who listens to Anthony's silence. He won't need someone perfect, just someone with a quiet heart. Asterisk." Veronica's voice wavered. "I thought I was protecting her legacy, but maybe I was just holding on to guilt." Ellie remained silent. Some moments didn't need commentary. Veronica looked toward the staircase. "May I see him?" Ellie nodded. "He just finished breakfast." Veronica found Anthony in the playroom, once again lining up his toy dinosaurs. She knelt nearby, uncertain. He looked at her, then back at Ellie, then stepped forward slowly and placed a small plastic dinosaur into her hand. "Triceratops," he said. "Strong, has armor." Veronica blinked fast, her eyes suddenly full. "Thank you, Anthony." He returned to his game without further ceremony. Later, Veronica pulled Ellie aside. "He trusts you. That's rare. I see it now." Ellie placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "He can trust you too, as long as we stay honest." Veronica nodded slowly. "Then let's be." By the end of the week, a revised guardianship amendment was filed. It kept Ellie's role intact and offered a clear path for Veronica to visit, to support, and to belong without disruption. For Anthony, it meant fewer battles. For Jonathan and Ellie, it meant a new kind of peace, less fragile, more lived in. It meant something like music after thunder. That night, as Ellie tucked Anthony into bed, he looked up with eyes that held no fear. "You are my home," he said. She kissed his forehead. "And you are mine." Winter laid a soft hush over the Ashford estate. Outside the tall windows, snowflakes floated lazily down, blanketing the lawn in white and muting the world beyond. The trees, stripped bare of leaves, stood like sentinels beneath a steel-gray sky. Indoors, the air was warm and filled with the scent of cinnamon and pine. The hearth glowed with steady flames, casting flickers of gold across the wooden floor. It felt like peace, earned fragile, but finally real. Anthony Ashford came bounding down the stairs, his pajamas a riot of rockets and stars. "Mommy, Daddy, it's a snow day," he shouted, flinging the front door open and watching the flurries swirl. He darted back inside, breathless with excitement, cheeks pink from the cold. In the living room, Ellie Robertson and Jonathan Ashford stood by the fireplace, their mugs warm in their hands. Anthony skidded to a stop in front of them. "Can we build a snowman?" he asked, his eyes shining. Jonathan smiled. "With you and Mommy." Bundled in coats, scarves, and mittens, they stepped into the yard. Ellie held Anthony's hand while Jonathan cleared branches from the grass, preparing a clean patch of snow. Together they rolled the snow into thick spheres. Anthony laughed, stamping his boots as he helped stack the pieces. Ellie guided his hands with gentle instructions, middle first, she reminded him, nudging the snowball into place. When they finished, the snowman stood tall and proud, with a carrot nose, black buttons for eyes, and twigs for arms. Anthony stepped back, admiration written all over his face. "It's like freedom," he whispered. Ellie knelt beside him, eye to eye. "Freedom," she said softly, "is when you're safe to be exactly who you are, no matter how cold the world gets." Jonathan stood behind them and wrapped his arms around them both. "We made something together," he said. They named the snowman Frederick in memory of Ellie's late son. Anthony carefully tied a red scarf around its neck. Ellie brushed the snow from his coat. Later inside the house, their hands warmed around mugs of hot chocolate. Anthony sipped slowly, then looked up at Jonathan. "Daddy, will you play music later?" Jonathan nodded. He always kept his promises. Their footprints frozen in the snow led back upstairs. In the living room, Jonathan took his seat at the upright piano. Anthony sat on the floor with a blanket wrapped around his shoulders, Ellie at his side. Their breaths slowed as Jonathan's fingers found the keys. The first notes were soft and deliberate, a melody drawn from memory. Anthony hummed along, slightly off-key but full of heart. Ellie closed her eyes, letting the music settle in her chest like warmth. They didn't notice Veronica Hale standing quietly in the doorway. She wasn't a threat now, just a guest. Candlelight softened her face, and her expression for once carried no weight of argument. As the piece ended, Mrs. Quinn entered with a tray of ginger snap cookies. Jonathan bowed his head slightly, then looked up and gestured to Veronica. "Would you like to sit?" he asked gently. She hesitated, then stepped forward. Anthony offered her a cookie without a second thought. "Thank you, sweetheart," she said, her fingers brushing his. Her voice was quiet. "This feels right." Ellie nodded. No need for words. That evening, Jonathan brought out the paperwork renewed guardianship the amendment filed. But instead of anxiety, the air was calm. Veronica signed first. Ellie followed. Jonathan sealed it. Anthony reached for Ellie's hand, and she intertwined her fingers with his. This moment, this trust was worth more than any legal stamp. In the days that followed, Ellie began part-time work as a reading specialist at the local community center. It was her first step back into the world, one made not from necessity, but from healing. Jonathan supported her completely. Anthony helped her sort books and toys for the children who would come. The community center became a place of connection. Ellie worked with small groups offering story time, reading guidance, and quiet encouragement. She listened to the kids the way she had listened to Anthony carefully, patiently. One afternoon, after story time, a shy girl named Ellie approached her. "Are you Anthony's mommy?" she asked. Ellie smiled. "Yes." The girl nodded. "He said you help everyone." Ellie knelt down. "Because everyone deserves a safe place to be heard." Later that day, Anthony squeezed her hand on the walk home. "You're like a superhero," he said softly. Ellie's chest tightened. No cape needed. They stopped by Frederick the Snowman, who was now slumping slightly under the sun. Anthony poked at the melting snow. "Even superheroes fade," he said. Ellie looked at him. "Not when they leave seeds." She offered him a handful of snow. "You build something today, tomorrow, another. That's how hope grows." Anthony's eyes were wide. "We plant hope in snow and stories," he whispered, and family Ellie added. That night, the house glowed warm against the deep winter dark. Jonathan tucked Anthony into bed. Ellie sat beside him, whispering the final lines of Asterisk Herald and the purple crayon. "When you draw your own moon," she read, "you shine it into the world." Anthony yawned. "Thank you, Mommy." She kissed his forehead. "Thank you for letting me shine." Jonathan stood nearby, resting a hand on Ellie's shoulder. "Our family shines brighter together." She turned to him. "The brightest." Outside, the branches creaked in the wind. A single star shone through the clouds. Inside the house breathed with quiet love and something that felt a lot like healing. The storm had passed, not because it never came, but because love had stood firm at its center. And as they moved forward into seasons unknown, they did so not in fear, but in unity. Together they had built something strong, something rooted, something real. And that was a seed of tomorrow blooming in winter's heart. Spring trembled just beyond the edge of the horizon, coaxing soft shoots of green across the grounds of the Ashford estate. The snow had finally released its grip, leaving behind damp soil, patches of budding grass, and the scent of something new in the air, promise perhaps. Inside the house, the atmosphere buzzed with a gentle excitement. It wasn't loud or chaotic, but rather the hum of life returning to rhythm after long months of uncertainty. Anthony Ashford, now moving with more confidence than ever, darted through the hallway with his backpack hanging from one shoulder. His pajamas had been traded for a shirt he'd picked himself blue with a rocket ship blazing upward. He bounced on the balls of his feet near the entryway, his energy barely contained. Today marked his first real party. A few children from his speech group were coming to celebrate his progress, not just his milestones, but the person he was becoming. In the kitchen, Ellie Robertson crouched by a cooler, tucking juice boxes between rows of fruit and cupcakes she had carefully arranged that morning. From the study, Jonathan Ashford appeared his usual formality, replaced by a casual button-down and jeans. In his hand, he held a plain manila envelope. He passed it to Ellie with a kind of reverent calm. Her eyes scanned the printed words quickly, then more slowly. Congratulations. Admission offered. Scholarship. It was from a private school, a rare one tailored for children with learning differences, one that saw potential where others saw struggle. She glanced toward Anthony, who was now demonstrating how his communication device worked to a curious friend with proud, measured enthusiasm. When he caught Ellie's gaze, he grinned, bright, unfiltered, and entirely his own. She closed the letter and folded into Jonathan's arms, her voice low but firm. He's more than ready. Outside, the lawn welcomed guests with sunshine and a gentle breeze that lifted helium balloons and set them bobbing above the swing set. Small clusters of parents chatted near folding chairs while children explored the yard. Mrs. Quinn, ever steady, carried platters of snacks out from the kitchen, setting them on a long table covered in a checkered cloth. By the fence, Veronica Hale stood beside Anna, deep in conversation that had none of the edge it once carried. Time and honesty had shifted something fundamental between them. Anthony approached his crutches tucked under his arms, knees muddy from earlier therapy games. He dropped to one knee in front of Ellie and peeled off a name sticker that read, "Anthony, I speak." He pressed it into her palm. "For you," he said, voice clear. Ellie touched it to her chest. "I will, sweet boy." Jonathan raised his hand, calling gently for attention. The chatter eased. "Thank you for being here," he began. "Today isn't only about how far Anthony has come. It's about what helped him get here. The consistency, the care, the courage to believe that love could be louder than fear." Ellie stood beside him, her hand resting lightly on his back. She looked toward Anthony now, orchestrating a cardboard castle-building session on the lawn, his voice rising in gleeful command. Laughter followed him like sunshine, unforced and pure. Veronica approached, holding a small potted flower. "For new roots," she said quietly. Ellie accepted it with a trembling breath. "Thank you." Veronica nodded. "For all of us." Anthony ran up, looked at the plant, and pointed. "That's hope," he said, matter-of-factly. Jonathan knelt beside him. "You planted it." Anthony beamed. Ellie scooped him into a hug, and Jonathan joined them. They stood together like that, arms linked, hearts full, as the day softened toward evening. Later, as golden light slipped through the sunroom windows, Ellie and Jonathan watched Anthony chase bubbles across the grass. His legs were steadier, his laughter louder. "He's free," Ellie whispered. Jonathan wrapped his arm around her. "He's ours." She turned to face him. "This isn't an ending. It's our beginning." He smiled. "Then let's write every word together." That night, after the last car pulled away and the lights were dimmed low, Ellie knelt beside Anthony's bed. He reached for her hand. "Tell me the first note of forever," he murmured. She kissed his cheek gently. "You already know." He blinked sleepily. "It's love." "Yes," she whispered. "Love is the first note of forever." She tucked the covers around him, and as his breathing slowed into sleep, Jonathan stood in the doorway, watching quietly. Ellie looked up, their eyes meeting across the still room. No more words were needed. The silence between them was rich with meaning. Outside, stars scattered across the sky like gentle promises. Within the walls of their home, warmth glowed in each room. They had weathered storms, legal battles, and personal reckonings. And now, in the hush of this spring night, what remained wasn't just peace, but something deeper, a shared truth. That family in its truest form is chosen each day, nurtured in the quiet, and held close in the dark. Theirs was a story still unfolding, written not on paper, but in the moments that mattered most. Thank you for staying with us through this heartwarming story, a journey not just of healing, but of hope, of real-life resilience, and the quiet power of love, spoken not always in words, but in presence. If you felt something along the way, if your heart stirred, your breath caught, or your thoughts lingered, we're deeply grateful. This story was made for you. Wherever in the world you are right now, whether you're watching from a quiet room, a bustling city, or somewhere in between, we'd love to know. Drop a comment and share where you're joining us from. This space, this growing circle of listeners and storytellers exists because of you. If this bedtime story spoke to your heart, if it echoed something real, please consider giving it a like or subscribing to help us keep telling stories like this, stories about truth connection and the kind of love that shows up and stays. From all of us here, thank you for listening, for feeling, for being part of this. We'll see you in the next story. Until then, stay safe, stay kind, and hold on to the moments that make life feel full.
Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.